Good morning. I want to start by saying thank you for being here this morning. I know we're all feeling those end of the semester pains and things are crazy, but I just love being here with my friends and my classmates and just getting some time to talk about Jesus, because really it's only Him that's getting us through this at this point, right? I want to talk to you this morning about something that I've dealt with over and over for years, and I think that some of you might be able to identify with this too. I think most of us in this room would agree that you are followers of Jesus, and we come here and we worship, and we know who Jesus is, and we love Him, and we try our best to follow Him. But here's what happens in my life more often than I'd like to admit. I'm one of those people. I'm one of those first couple rows of chapel people. I worship with hands high and waving, and I'm excited. And when I'm really into it, I'm down on my knees, and there might be tears, and it's really a big thing for me, okay? And I love the songs that are like, my whole life is yours, Jesus. Like, you paid it all, so I'll give you my all. Have your way. You know those songs? I love them. And I believe those things with all my heart. I do. I sing them without any shred of pretense or acting. But I'm also one of these people. When it comes to how I spend my time, how I spend my money, how I make decisions and plans, my very first response is usually the most selfish option. I walk away from worship services, and all of a sudden, I just decide that my life is my own again. And my time is mine, and my stuff is mine, and my friendships are for me, and my comfort and my happiness is king. And then I come to Jesus, and He shows me these two sides of me, and I'm devastated. I really do mean that my life is His. I mean that with my whole heart, but I'm pitifully unfaithful. I don't follow through with my commitments to Him. I'm a follower of Jesus, but I wander around and I go in circles and I forget to look at Him, and I get stuck in these ruts of guilt and shame over and over because I love Him, but I have such a hard time following Him faithfully. Has anyone ever felt like this? I know I'm not the only one because I sing with other followers of Jesus all the time. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Does anyone else feel prone to wander? Has anyone else ever felt the crippling guilt of your own faithfulness compared to Jesus' incredible and constant faithfulness? We're so prone to wandering. Now, with that in the back of our minds, I want to explore a concept today found in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 15. In this chapter, Moses is describing how God intends for Israel to deal with poor people among them. This chapter is all about God's deep love for the broken and the poor, and He cares for their well-being. So I'm going to start reading in verse 12. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you for 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I gave you this command today. Okay, so picture the situation with me. A Hebrew man is in debt. He can't get out of it. And so he goes to the man that he can't pay back and says, okay, I'll be your slave for 6 years. And after 6 years, I'll earn my freedom and our debts will be cleared. So I'm thinking, that's rough. Like 6 years in my mind is a lot of years. Like that's not just a little bit of time. Like that's college and a half. Like that's a lot. And so that seems like a lot to submit to when he was a free man at first, right? So this man serves faithfully for 6 years. He works hard. He probably has a long list of responsibilities. He's not just working 9 to 5 probably. Like he's a slave. And then finally, his 7th year rolls around and he's free. And so he's released from his status as a slave. He's free to go and be free. And his schedule is his own. He can do what he wants. He can go where he wants, when he wants. But not only that, the master supplies him with everything that he could need to start his new life. He is given animals and grain and wine, and he's lacking nothing. He can go and be free and well provided for. He's taken care of. The master is to be wildly generous to this former slave and give him complete freedom, no strings attached. The debts are fully canceled. So good news, right? That's a good situation. So keep that in mind, and let's read the next few verses of this passage, verse 16 and 17. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you, because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take an owl not the bird, it's a sharp pointed tool, and push it through the earlobe in his door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. This passage messes with me. The fact that there's a provision for an optional lifetime of slavery baffles me, especially after reading how well these slaves were provided for after they're free. The freedom sounds so good. And so I just don't understand why this is in there. Was it that big of a problem that these slaves go free and they're like, no, we don't want to go? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. And I don't understand why it's in there. Why did there have to be a provision for slaves that just didn't want to go, you know? And I think the only reason that it could be is that a life of freedom is nothing to this slave in comparison to the love that he has for his master. He could be flooded with provision and riches and all the opportunity in the world, but none of it's alluring because he just loves his master. That's powerful, right? This type of servant became known as a bond servant, a slave that chose a lifetime of devotion to his master when he could have been free, and he did it purely for the sake of love. So I want to pick apart a little bit what it means to be a bondservant, and I believe that we'll be able to glean some wisdom from it and maybe be able to solve some of this problem of our unfaithfulness. So the first thing that the bondservant is identified by is his pierced ear. This part is just wild to me. So the master brings him to the doorframe of his house. He gets this tool called an awl, A-W-L, not the bird. And this is a tool with a sharp point, and it was used for like boring holes in wood or leather. So like sharp, this is intense, but in this case, is putting it through his ear. It's not like the little ear piercing station at Claire's, you know? Like this is like the original gauges, like holes in your ear, it's big. So the main thing that I get from this is that these slaves were serious and devoted. You don't just go and let somebody do that to you unless you mean it, right? So he's saying, come and permanently mark me, bore a hole in my own ear so that everybody knows that I'm committed to your household for my whole life. The next attribute of the bondservant is that he's willing to commit to his master for his entire life. There's no provision in this contract for release or freedom for the rest of his life. He's saying, that's not on the table anymore. You offered me the freedom. It wasn't interesting to me. I don't want it because I love you. So no provision for freedom. He's there for his whole life. So the devotion of this slave is extreme. It's intense. So I wonder if you're hearing this, like I am, and thinking, this is irrational. Who would want to choose a lifetime of slavery? Is any master really that good? Would that ever be worth it? Especially since we have such a high value for independence in our society, right? My selfish thought is, I don't care how good that master is, I want my freedom. So maybe we're getting kind of closer to the root of the issue of our unfaithfulness. So here's an interesting thing. The Greek word for bondservant, doulos, is the same word for slave in the New Testament. So every time you see doulos in the New Testament, it'll probably just say servant in your Bible, but it's talking about this bondservant concept. So listen to how this word is used. Romans 1:1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, set apart for the gospel of God, doulos. James 1:1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, doulos. 2 Peter 1:1. Simon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ, doulos. Jude 1:1. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ. So this old practice from the laws in the Torah is used here to describe their commitment to Jesus. So for all of these disciples, the first thing that they wanted to be identified by was that they were bond servants. Their whole lives were given to him for his will and his purposes. And from the beginning of their messages to the churches, they're saying, Jesus is my master. He's pierced my ear. I'm part of his household. I'm under his authority. I'm his. I'm not my own. And I think we can find ourselves in this story too. It's not just for these big-time apostles in the Bible, right, that changed the world. It's for us too. So here's where we find ourselves. We had a debt that we couldn't pay. We were enslaved to sin. We were broken and enslaved to it. And so we entered into relationship with Jesus, and he offered us freedom, and he forgave our debts. And so now we have two options. We can choose to take that freedom and run with it. We can do what we will with our life. We can call him our king, but we can go and chase after comfort and pleasure. Or we can choose to be a bondservant. And we can let Jesus pierce our ears. And we can choose to be part of his household. Now this is important to remember. It wouldn't be love if he forced us into slavery. Jesus will not force you into unwilling service. You are forgiven and you're free, and Jesus won't force you to lay your life down for him. It must be given willingly. But I'd like to propose that being a bondservant to Jesus is the most beautiful, worthy, and maybe even the most liberating way to live. David Wilkerson, the founder of Teen Challenge, once said this: Christ is enough. There's nothing in the world worth losing sight of his presence. To serve him, to be led by him, to come and go as he commands, that is life on the highest plane. Now, I really believe that being a slave to Jesus has to be the most full, thrilling way to live, even though that sounds kind of like a paradox. To be in communion with God, the one that created you, to serve his purposes for the whole world, that doesn't sound like slavery to me at all. But when we hear the word slave, we cringe, right? Because we're taught all of our life to be independent and to be strong and make something of ourselves. And then we hear these big authors in the New Testament who we love saying, I'm just a bondservant. I'm not independent. I'm his. I'm not my own. And so we think of rule following and we think of slavery when we hear that word, and we think bondage. But what if the master that we're following is the most true, most kind, most gracious, most wonderful person than anybody on the planet? And that changes things, right? He accepted us into his household. He offered us the freedom from our bondage of sin. He lavished us with his love and mercy. So what other response is there than to fully submit our lives to him? So how do we live then? What's the response? When your ear is pierced, your interest becomes secondary to the interests of your master. When your ear is pierced, your life is dedicated to his purposes, not your own. His mission is your mission. His interests are your interests. Your ear is pierced. And here's where we think I struggle as Christians or as an American college student, is that submission and slavery is scary. It doesn't make sense to us. It's scary because it's not what we're used to. And I think what we really like to do is we like to kind of hang out in the front yard of the master's house, right? We want to kind of have the freedom to make our own decisions. We want to have fun with our lives and follow our dreams and do our own stuff. But we want Jesus close enough, right? We want to need him when we need him, you know? And so I think we kind of hang out around that maybe front porch area and think that we're close enough. When really close enough isn't close at all. So here's the other problem. A lot of times we have a lot of great intentions to be faithful. Like when I'm worshiping, I really mean that. I mean everything that I say. But my heart is prone to wandering, right? And so I make all these commitments to him, and I lift my hands and I bend my knees and I say my life is his, but then I go and wander, and we're stuck. I want to be a bondservant. I want to let him pierce my ear, but my wandering heart gets me every single time. But there's hope for us today, friends. There's hope because a man named Jesus was a bondservant long before we were. Philippians 2 says that Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, doulos. Jesus had all the right in the world to claim all the rights as God and embrace his freedom and stay in heaven where everything was fine. He could have commanded those hosts of angels in heaven to come and take him down from that cross. He didn't use that right to his advantage, though. He was a bondservant to his Father. His Father's will was his will. He was all about his Father's business. He died and he shed his blood for his Father's purposes, purely for the sake of love. His ear was pierced to the Master's household. And here's the beautiful thing. Jesus was the perfect bondservant, perfectly submitted in slavery to his Father to the point of shedding his own blood on the cross. He knew that we couldn't be faithful on our own. He knew that we would try to obey and submit, and sin would rear its ugly head every time. So he paid for it. It's because of his grace that we can have our ears pierced to the door and stay faithful. We can only be bondservants when we're dependent on him. It's only through his blood that we can be perfectly submitted to the Father. It's through his blood that we can set free from that cycle of disobedience and guilt and shame. And I believe that the Lord wants to give us hope for a new kind of devotion today. I believe that he's calling us to be bondservants, to lay down our lives for the sake of love. He's calling us to be part of his household, to have our ear pierced to his doorframe. And I also believe that he's giving us freedom from our wandering. Freedom from the double life of worship followed by disobedience. And the beautiful thing is that when we're bound to him, we're truly free. Free from our bondage to sin, free from our chronic unfaithfulness, free from our cycles of disobedience. Bondage to the house of God is the only true way to be free. So I want to close this morning with the words of this old hymn as our prayer today. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. Amen.